the final weeks of World War II, as the Third Reich collapsed around him, one man made a decision that would shape the next half-century of Western intelligence. He didn't flee. He didn't surrender to the Soviets closing in from the east. Instead, he buried something, carefully, deliberately, in the Austrian mountains. 50 canisters of microfilm. Years of files on Soviet military operations, Soviet agents, Soviet infrastructure built up over 3 years of war. Then he walked toward the Americans and offered them a trade. His name was Reinhard Gehlen. He had spent the war as the Wehrmacht's chief intelligence officer on the Eastern Front, mapping the Soviet Union's military capacity for Adolf Hitler's war machine. The Americans took the trade. What followed is one of the most consequential and most quietly buried arrangements in the history of Western intelligence. To understand what Gehlen offered the Americans, you need to understand what he had built. Reinhard Gehlen was born in 1902 into a German military family. By the height of World War II, he headed Fremdheer Ost, Foreign Armies East, the Wehrmacht's intelligence branch responsible for tracking Soviet forces. For 3 years, from 1942 onward, his organization maintained what was arguably the most detailed intelligence picture of the Soviet Union possessed by any power in the world. His analysts mapped Red Army divisions, tracked supply lines, identified command structures, recruited informants inside Soviet-controlled territory. His Eastern Front assessments were, by most accounts, technically sophisticated and operationally significant. But by 1944, Gehlen had also seen clearly where the war was going. With what his post-war interrogators described as almost clinical detachment, he began preparing for the next conflict, the one he believed was inevitable between the Soviet Union and the Western powers. He ordered his most sensitive files copied onto microfilm. Soviet agent networks. Military assessments. Sources still active inside the USSR. In the spring of 1945, as Berlin fell, those 50 canisters were hidden in the Austrian Alps near Bad Elster. Then, in May 1945, he made contact with American forces. The Americans were initially cautious. Gehlen was, after all, a senior officer of a defeated enemy. His intelligence apparatus had operated on the Eastern Front, a theater defined by systematic brutality against civilian populations. There were legitimate questions about who, exactly, had staffed his networks and what they had done. But the caution did not last long. The OSS, America's wartime intelligence service, was being dissolved. A power vacuum was forming at exactly the moment the Soviet Union was expanding across Eastern Europe. The Americans needed human intelligence networks inside Soviet territory, and they needed them immediately. Gehlen had those networks, or claimed to. In September 1945, he was flown to the United States covertly, under an assumed identity. For the next year, he worked with American handlers at Fort Hunt, Virginia, in a program that came to be called Operation Rusty. The deal was being formalized, and almost no one outside a small circle of American intelligence officers knew it was happening. By 1946, Gehlen was back in West Germany with American authorization and American funding. Operating out of a compound in Pulich, a quiet town near Munich, he rebuilt his wartime intelligence network under a deliberately unremarkable name, the Gehlen Organization. On paper, a private consultancy. In practice, a functioning intelligence service staffed almost entirely by former Wehrmacht and SS officers, running with the tacit approval of the United States government. At its peak, the organization employed several hundred professional staff and maintained networks across Eastern Europe and inside the Soviet Union. It ran safe houses, courier routes, and signals analysis. Beginning in 1949, it reported, at least nominally, to the CIA, which by then was formally funding its operations. But here's where the record becomes genuinely difficult to resolve. A CIA internal review from the early 1950s, portions declassified decades later, noted that the organization had been penetrated at several levels and that some intelligence Gehlen delivered had likely been shaped or fabricated by Soviet counterintelligence. There was a real possibility the Soviets knew about the arrangement and were feeding false information back through it. The most troubling figure in this picture was a man named Heinz Felfe. Felfe was one of Gehlen's most senior counterintelligence officers, the man responsible for detecting Soviet penetration of the organization itself. He had a distinguished record, significant access, and the full trust of his superiors. In 1961, West German authorities arrested him. He had been a KGB agent since 1951. For a full decade, Felfe had been sitting at the center of West Germany's intelligence apparatus, feeding the Soviets everything he saw. The damage assessment ran to hundreds of compromised operations and exposed agents across the Eastern Bloc. The man Gehlen had trusted to prevent infiltration had been the infiltrator. And this raised a question that American and West German investigators spent years trying to answer: how much of what the Gehlen organization reported to the CIA over that decade was real, and how much had been constructed by Soviet intelligence to mislead the West about their actual capabilities? There was no clean answer. There still isn't. In 1956, West Germany formalized what had been operating in the shadows for a decade. The Gehlen organization was officially absorbed into the West German government as the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the BND, West Germany's foreign intelligence service. Reinhard Gehlen became its first president. He held that position until 1968. For 12 years, the man who had run Eastern Front intelligence for the Third Reich served as the chief of West Germany's official spy service, a formal partner of NATO, the CIA, and British intelligence. When Gehlen's employment records were examined after his retirement, they showed extensive recruitment of former SS and SD officers, individuals who had not merely served the Nazi regime administratively, but had in some cases been directly involved in wartime atrocities. Gehlen's defenders argued that experienced intelligence professionals were simply not available in post-war Germany without this background. His critics argued the arrangement gave people who should have faced accountability institutional protection inside a Western intelligence service instead. The CIA's own position on this, when declassified documents were released in 2001 following sustained pressure from historians and journalists, was unambiguous. American officials had been aware of the backgrounds of many Gehlen organization employees and made a deliberate decision to continue the relationship regardless. The justification, stated explicitly in some internal communications, was strategic necessity. But the Felfe case had permanently complicated that justification. If the organization's counterintelligence function had been compromised from 1951 onward, and Felfe's own testimony confirmed this, then the operational value of the entire network during a critical decade of the Cold War remained genuinely uncertain. The intelligence the West used to assess Soviet military capability, to read Soviet intentions, to build strategic planning around. Some meaningful portion of it had potentially passed through a channel the Soviets were actively managing. Reinhard Gehlen retired in 1968 and passed away in 1979. He left behind a memoir widely criticized by historians for selective memory and self-serving omissions. The full scope of what the Gehlen organization actually delivered, and what it ultimately cost, has never been comprehensively established. Some of the relevant files remain restricted to this day. The bargain struck in an Austrian forest in 1945 is still, in certain important respects, unresolved. Here is the question this story leaves us with. When a government decides that strategic advantage outweighs accountability, when it looks at a man's record, knows exactly what it's looking at, and says deliberately that history matters less than what he can do for us now, where does that logic end? Gehlen wasn't an exception. He was a policy decision made by people in offices with full awareness of what they were choosing. Was it necessary? Was it defensible? Or did the West compromise something it couldn't fully recover? Drop your answer below. This is the kind of history worth arguing about. And if this is the kind of story you think more people should know, subscribe. There's more where this came from.